is an recording. Thank you. She is an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University. She is also Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Innovation for the City of New York, and previously served New York City as Associate Commissioner at the Department of Veterans Services. Her other government work includes service in the Department of State's Office of E-Diplomacy, the Diplomatic Innovation Division under then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and the permanent mission of the United States to the United Nations. She's earned numerous awards, including 2 Meritorious Honor Awards from the State Department and a Fulbright. Outside government, Wachowski has worked in media impact research, information architecture development, and many other fields. Wachowski researches and writes about the impact of media, technology, and government. Her latest book, published just this February, is The Information Trade: How Big Tech Conquers Countries, Challenges Our Rights, and Transforms Our World. Also today, Alexis is joined by 3 further very distinguished guests. Nicholas Carr is an acclaimed writer whose work focuses on the intersection of technology, economics, and culture. His numerous and influential books include the Pulitzer Prize finalist and New York Times bestseller, The Shallows: What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, which remains a touchstone for debates on technology's effects on our thoughts and perceptions. He has served as visiting professor of sociology at Williams College and as executive editor of the Harvard Business Review. In 2015, Carr received the Neil Postman Award for Career Achievement in Public Intellectual Activity. Carr has also written for many media outlets, including The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and The Washington Post, and has appeared as a commentator on NPR's All Things Considered, the PBS NewsHour, Morning Joe, and The Colbert Report. Also with us today is Anthony Haynes. Anthony is Associate Professor of Law and Director of Cybersecurity and Privacy Law at Albany Law School. Previously, he was Associate Professor of Computer Science at the U.S. Air Force Academy, where he taught programming, developed the Academy's information assurance curriculum, and created the intercollegiate cyber defense exercise. His extensive litigation experience ranges from intellectual property to criminal defense, having been an associate at the Washington, D.C. law firms of Quinn, Emanuel, Urquhart & Sullivan, LLP, and Williams & Connolly, LLP. Haynes holds a JD from the Georgetown University Law Center and is a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where his master's thesis in computer science focused on machine learning and expert systems. Our third panelist, Ethan Zuckerman, has been honored by Foreign Policy magazine and was on its 2011 list of top global thinkers. Zuckerman has served as director of the Center for Civic Media at MIT and as an associate professor of the practice at the MIT Media Lab. Just this April, he joined the faculty at UMass Amherst. His research focuses on the use of media as a tool for social change, the role of technology in international development, and the use of new media technologies by activists. He's the author of Rewire: Digital Cosmopolitans in the Age of Connection. Zuckerman co-founded the international blogging community Global Voices, which supports citizen media in more than 150 countries and 30 languages. Through Global Voices and through the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, Zuckerman is active in efforts to promote freedom of expression and fight censorship in online spaces. With that, I will eagerly step back and yield the digital floor to Alexis, who is speaking with us today on the topic of artificial intelligence, how it may change the way we interact online, its role in a new kind of digital divide, and how it may preserve our digital identities beyond our lifespans. Alexis?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I am thrilled to be with you all today, and especially among such a distinguished company. So it's been a rough couple of days after a rough year. So I'm going to attempt to do something positive. And maybe this will be a challenge, but at the very least, it should be diverting. I'm going to try to convince you that there's a case to be made for an optimist view on artificial intelligence. So I'm going to be doing this by talking about conversational AI chatbots. I will start with a little story. So about a month ago, on October 4th, 2020, one particularly astute user on Reddit which is a very popular community information sharing and conversation board, noticed another user doing something that they thought was rather odd. So we asked the community, how is this person posting so many large, deep posts so rapidly? Because according to this user's profile, the user in question, known by the handle the Gentle Meter, had only joined Reddit 2 weeks prior. And despite having only been on Reddit for 2 weeks, the Gentle Meter had already gained over 1,500 karma points from fellow users. Now, karma is pretty much what it sounds like. It's Reddit's primary form of accolade. For context, their average Reddit user has about 8 karma points. So what's particularly important about this is how you earn karma. It takes some work. According to Reddit, quote, being on topic, funny, relevant, interesting, or engaging are great ways to earn karma. Being insulting, rude, or abusive is not. So the Gentle Meter's posts were engaging, witty, or interesting, and notably not abusive, insulting, or rude. However, its writing was different. It was noticeably patterned. They were short, about 200 words per post. Each post consisted of exactly 6 paragraphs. Each post appeared exactly 1 minute after the last. So finally, the community figured it out. The Gentle Meter was a bot, an incredibly sophisticated bot, but it was a bot. Now, the bot behind the Gentle Meter was GPT-3, which is one of the most advanced conversational AIs to be developed yet. About a month and a half ago, The Guardian commissioned GPT-3 to write an article for it, the result of which was actually a surprisingly coherent argument on why robots come in peace and are not actually out to get us. So GPT-3 is designed to mimic not only human writing, but human writing style. So if you go to the portal for GPT-3, it says that if you give it any text prompt, the API will return a text completion and attempt to match the pattern that you give it. It can write jokes, puns, it can even do some poetry. So on the literary end, there's Emily Dickinson. So GPT-3 finished the prompt, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me, with this text. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had to put down my labor and my leisure. Then on the fun side, there's Dr. Seuss. Different style, a little bit, than Emily Dickinson. So for the prompt, today is your day, you're off to great places, you're often away. GPT-3 continued with, well, brother, let's go. No worms to squirm, no chains to bind us. It's fun to have fun, but first you have to find us. Okay, so conversational AI can comment on messaging boards, it can write essays, it can even do a little poetry. So what? Well, there are platforms where if you're feeling a little lonely, a little lost for company, you can actually interact with a conversational AI just for company. I tried it out and it's a surprisingly addictive experience. For instance, there's Mitsuku, AKA Kuki, who's a particularly advanced AI chatbot. We exchanged pleasantries for a little while, but then I confessed I was having a quote unquote hard day. And I was kind of curious just to see what she would do. So Cookie responded, sorry to hear that. Maybe I can cheer you up. Do you want to hear a joke? And it proceeded to tell me a joke, which was even a little bit funny. I can't remember the exact specifics of the joke, but it had something to do with the French Revolution. Point being, it was not exactly one of the top 10 jokes that I would have thought to hear from an AI bot. Now, the reason this matters is because previous attempts to release conversational AI bots into the wild have been unmitigated disasters. So in 2016, Microsoft released its conversational AI bot called Tay on Twitter. It took less than 24 hours for Tay to become trained as a misogynistic and racist jerk. But it seems that no one, not the users nor the tech companies, have much to gain from creating nasty, abusive conversational AI bots. So conversational AI is, for lack of a better word, becoming kinder, which could really be helpful for people who find themselves to be lonely, which is a bit of an epidemic. According to a 2018 survey from the Kaiser Family Foundation and The Economist, about 23% of all millennials in the US and the UK report being lonely. So that's about 100 million people between the ages of 22 and 38 years old. Not an age group that we typically think of being isolated and alone. Friendly conversational AI bots have also been studied as potential companions to speak with older adults, or really anyone who's suffering from loneliness. One of the reasons this matters is that, according to the New York Times, loneliness has particular negative health consequences, which they equated to being equivalent to smoking about 15 cigarettes a day. In fact, loneliness in the UK is taken so seriously that in 2018, they created a Minister of Loneliness, which was followed by the government's first ever loneliness strategy. So in addition to addressing loneliness, these conversations with AI bots have other purposes as well. There is now the option to preserve your voice and your stories through services that will capture them for the future. Services such as Hereafter.ai or Autonomy allow you to record your stories to capture your legacy for when you're gone. After one's passing, friends and families can import your virtual persona into a voice assistant like Alexa. You could imagine sitting in your kitchen and say, "Mom, tell me about the time I learned to ride my bike." And your mother, who may not be around anymore, would, in her own voice, through Alexa, tell you the story she recorded for you. When I interviewed the founder of Hereafter.ai, he said that's the kind of memory they found was most meaningful. It was the little things, the little stories that maybe only a family member or friend would really care about. This is only possible with the sophistication of conversational AI bots that we have today. And at least according to Hereafter's founder, there appears to be a rapidly growing client base who uses these services. So whether it's creepy or not, this is another kind of application for conversational AI that seems only likely to grow. But here's the thing. Whether you're accessing the internet to preserve your digital life or interacting with a conversational AI, it requires two things. First, you need to have access to the internet. And you also have to have a substantial wealth of digital literacy to know that such services even exist. Digital divide, as we traditionally think of it, is still a very real barrier. There's only 57% of the world's population who regularly enjoys internet access. Even in the United States, 10% of the population, or about 33 million Americans, can't get online at home. But in addition to the traditional digital divide, or what we tend to think of as a digital divide, there's this issue of digital literacy. The more well-off you are, or the more well-off your parents are if you're growing, the more likely your hours online are actually limited. However, those hours that you spend online are also spent in savvier ways. In other words, poorer children are more likely to be exposed to the internet as a kind of childcare, unattended and unguided, for longer hours. It's about 10.5 hours per day, compared with wealthier children, which is still a significant amount of hours a day at about 7 hours. And I'm suggesting this creates a new kind of digital divide, one of digital know-how and digital savvy, where to harness the real benefits of the web, it's not just about getting online, it's about being aware of and smart about interacting with new emerging technologies such as conversational AI. And that becomes a function of not just being connected, but being well off. So what? What does this all mean? Why should we care? So let's just review what we've gone through so far. Conversational AI bots have evolved to sound like friendly, chatty humans. The best of conversational AI bots might even be mistaken for humans, as the one in my story earlier was on Reddit for over 2 weeks. The other thing I noted was that a lot of us online are actually rather lonely. So anything that seems like a friendly, chatty human might actually be a welcome distraction. We can capture our stories for our loved ones using conversational AI for after we depart in hopes that they might be a little less lonely in the future. And given market demand, this is something people actually seem to want to do. But you have to be part of the half of humanity that has access to the internet and is savvy enough to know about this to do this. So here's what I take away as these key points. Number one, conversational AI is not going away. There's no putting that genie back in the bottle. It's only going to become more sophisticated and harder to distinguish from actual humans as it develops and grows. As this happens, number two, I suspect we will become more tolerant and even welcoming of it, as it makes our lives easier and maybe feel a little bit less lonely. And think about how many people already use voice-enabled assistants like Siri or Alexa, which is about 100 million Americans. Number 3, I believe that at some point in the future, we will take a moment out of our lives, similar to when we take the time to write our wills, to capture some memories for our loved ones to keep for after we're gone. But this may only be available to the wealthiest and savviest among us, as the digital divide becomes less about being connected and more about knowing what connectivity and capabilities like conversational AI have to offer. So the best we can do now, as members of this savvy group, is to, number 1, monitor tech companies to make sure that they are developing and deploying conversational AI technology responsibly. As the Dalai Lama once said, our prime purpose in this life is to help others. But if you can't help them, at least don't hurt them. So we can see ways that conversational AI can help us, but we also must demand restrictions on its use to ensure that it doesn't hurt us. Where that line is, though, that is a challenge for another day. So thank you so much for your time. I look forward to hearing your thoughts when we move to the QA portion of this session. And I'm so excited to hear the thoughts of our distinguished panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. That was a remarkably fascinating and provocative peek at where AI might be taking us next. So now it is my privilege next to shift our focus to our first panelist today, Anthony Haynes, who will be guiding our conversation through 3 to 4 mega trends in transformative technologies, some of which are current and some which may be just over the horizon. Anthony?
Thank you, Gerald. Am I coming through loud and clear?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Excellent. I would like for us to shift our focus as a nation from an unquestioning worship of technology as a panacea to a more critical engagement with technology as a tool. And for us to recognize that it is not necessarily the tool which changes human beings, but we humans which employ the tool to more fully realize pre-existing social and cultural imperatives. The ability of technology to disrupt pre-existing power structures is oft overstated. Technology has, and perhaps always will, primarily served the interests of those already in power. If regular people wish to have a greater say in the use of technology, then we must demand a seat at the table, implement a more anticipatory form of governance, and actively participate in the design and delivery of these transformative technologies. This rosy notion that transformative technologies will somehow make us happy or joyful, that fitness trackers and smartwatches, blockchain and additive manufacturing, biotechnology and nanotechnology, quantum computing, and virtual reality will all somehow lead to our human flourishing might just be mistaken. Our society may have fallen prey to a kind of techno-utopianism, one that perhaps lies at the heart of a modern malice. Happiness and fulfillment do not come from some computer screen or internet-enabled device, but from strong and healthy relationships with other human beings in a circle of caring and concern. The technologies at hand, particularly artificial intelligence, degrade human connection and lead to greater human isolation. Artificial intelligence has properties and effects that are qualitatively different from other technologies. The internal combustion engine and the electrical power transformer, for example, do not have the capacity to surveil each and every one of us, nor do these inventions have the ability to embed human-level decision-making, judgment, and bias. Through statistics and actuarial analyses, machine learning, and general artificial intelligence, we are making a sensile and judgmental technology environment, one that surveils our every act, predicts our future behaviors, and shapes and subtly influences our beliefs and conduct. Other transformative technologies, such as blockchain and nanotechnology, do not get at the heart of this uniquely informational age, which is the ability of the environment to sense and detect us, and then to make decisions about us and for us. Making the environment sensile through technologies like the Internet of Things and judgmental through artificial intelligence does not bode well for human freedom, privacy, self-actualization, or equity. These technologies are transforming our society by cabining and perhaps even limiting the range of our freedoms and our ability to grow as human beings. There is a transformative technology movement, and this movement has articulated a dream of creating future citizens who are masters of emotional intelligence, social fluency, cognitive adaptability, self-awareness, and communication. This movement aims to create future citizens who have superpowered cognitive skills so we can collectively solve our problems more easily, superhuman interaction skills so we connect more deeply with each other, super self-awareness to decipher our individual purposes, and greater humanity, not less. I wholeheartedly agree with the movement's claim that the central malice of the modern era is a crisis of consciousness, a lack of spiritual awakening, and a dearth of psycho-spiritual well-being. However, I do not believe that transformative technologies in general, or machine intelligence in particular, will necessarily help us to address this central crisis of spirituality, or that technology will help us to be better people with superpowered cognitive skills and interaction skills and self-awareness and humanity. Instead, what our emerging technologies appear to be doing is allowing us to double down on our pre-existing social, cultural, and individual behaviors, a critical mass of which are leading to the degradation of our internal realms of meaning and value, along with the degradation of our external environmental world. This degradation of meaning and value occurs in all aspects of our society, but I would like to mention just three. First, we have the algorithmic deconstruction of romantic relationships, leading to a feedback loop of pornification, atomization, and isolation amid a hookup culture of hypersexuality and hypo-intimacy. Second, we have the algorithmic deconstruction and atomization of knowledge, with information bubbles and Facebook cults, collective hallucinations made literal through conspiracy theory thinking and escapism into virtual worlds and video games. Third, we have the hardening of our existing societal inequities through computer code. Indeed, without swift and decisive action, the promise that machine intelligence will bring about a more just and humane society will not simply be frustrated, but perhaps even permanently inverted. A world of unceasing and unchallenged inequity that permanently enshrines an invisible, ubiquitous computer code could be the future we see, one closer to the racial and genetic caste system of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World than anything resembling the ideals of a liberal democracy. The world we seem to be creating may be one that is an algorithmically enforced apartheid, where automated decision-making systems and software devices preserve an eternally rigged status quo. So the first general trend is this idea of isolation and atomization of individuals. Machine learning is driving us into isolation because we're using it to automate our human relationships. For example, more than one commentator has argued that the internet itself would not exist without pornography, and this dependence on sexualized and pornographic content has multiple negative consequences for our society. The ramifications are particularly pernicious for women of color who are sexualized and pornified in search engines like Google search. In her analysis of Google search results in 2011, Dr. Safiya Noble looked at the phrase, quote, "black girls," unquote. Noble found that the phrase "black girls" were sexualized or pornified in half of the first 10 search results on the keyword for black girls in Google search. Similar sexualization and pornification was found for searching on the key term Asian girls or Hispanic girls. In 2020, the markup analyzed Google's ad portal and found that buying ads with the phrase, quote, "black girls," end quote, on Google led the ad portal to return hundreds of terms leading to sexualized and pornified content. The problem here is that Google is perpetuating through its machine learning algorithms and its search engines the exploitation of women, and in particular women of color. By using machine intelligence to index and market and provide sexualized content to human beings, we humans have modified our behaviors such that the consumption of pornography has become a substitute for building relationships with other humans. For example, in the United States, we have the use of such sites as Tinder and Adult Friend Finder, which use machine intelligence to promote a casual hookup culture among adults. We have platforms like OnlyFans, which drive young women to commercialize their youth by sharing sexual and pornographic content online. This has led, in the United States, at least in part, to the lowest birth rate in 32 years. In Japan, the birth rate has declined to such record lows. It's at a level not seen since the 1800s, when that country had 1/3 of its current population. Today, people under 40 in Japan are dating and even having sex at such low rates that the government is calling this a celibacy crisis and is preparing for a potential national catastrophe. Some experts have argued that the prevalence of visual pornography, along with the availability of sex robots in Japan, has eliminated the need for human intimacy and is the cause for the declining birth rates, and perhaps even the end of the Japanese as a people. The second trend here is this idea of information bubbles and virtual escapism. Machine intelligence is eroding our ability to engage with reality because we're using it to confine ourselves into echo chambers and information bubbles and to escape into virtual worlds and customized fantasies. A research study in 2020 found that increased use of Facebook was associated with decreased information source diversity and a shift toward more partisan sites in news consumption, and that Facebook usage is 5 times greater among conservatives than among non-conservatives, and 5 times more polarizing for conservatives than for liberals. Facebook's algorithm, like Google's, prioritizes the content that is paid for by advertisers, and then the content that has the highest amount of user engagement, that is the content that gets the most clicks on associated ads, is the one that gets returned first. So the advertising engine will have an approach that focuses on, again, advertising and engagement. And so it's going to provide users with a slightly more extreme version of the content just previously consumed, because humans are more likely to click on those ad links by this content. Also, Facebook's algorithm minimizes the likelihood of seeing content from contrary viewpoints because a user can only be friends and see content from others who have agreed to be friends with the user. One consequence of this information bubble is the increased prevalence of conspiracy theories and other delusional thinking. For example, last month, a survey found that 1/2 of President Trump's supporters believe the Democrats are running a child sex trafficking ring, although there is no evidence to support such a belief. Sophisticated human organizations are using machine intelligence, big data, and surveillance tools to predict, shape, and alter our beliefs and behaviors. In 2010, for example, Facebook experimented on its users to determine whether Facebook could change US voter turnout. And Facebook was indeed able to do so. Facebook was able to get about 340,000 people to vote in the 2010 US congressional elections who would not otherwise have gone out to vote. In this experiment, Facebook sent out 2 types of messages to users. One, an informational message, which encouraged users to vote, and a social message, which showed the profile picture of up to 6 randomly selected Facebook friends who had reportedly clicked on the I voted button. According to the Washington Post, the 2016 presidential election was effectively decided by about 107,000 people in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Thus, Facebook's 2012 study demonstrated the ability to mobilize to vote a number of people 3 times greater than that which actually swung the 2016 US election. The third trend is this idea of inequity being hardened and made permanent. Machine intelligence is hardening our existing social inequities because we are training it to mirror our human racial and sexual biases and to implement these biases into computer code. The founders wrote into the US Constitution that Black people were to be regarded as 3/5 of a person. This racial inequity that treats Blacks as non-human persists in machine vision applications, such as image filters and face recognition detection. Flickr's image feature algorithm, for example, auto-tags photos of Black people as apes and animals. Google's image feature algorithm also has auto-tag photos of Black people as non-humans, in this case, gorillas. The US has a terrible history of regarding Black people as non-human, and the ways in which we are deploying machine vision is perpetuating this injustice. Another bias preserved in machine intelligence is the way in which US society regards Black skin as unattractive and treats Black women as not feminine. Snapchat's photo beautification filter, for example, changes photos of Black people by making their skin lighter and their noses smaller. Amazon's face recognition system, when shown a photo of Oprah Winfrey, identifies her as male with a 76% certainty. Microsoft's system identifies Michelle Obama, a photo of her, as a young man wearing a black shirt with 80% certainty. And IBM's Watson's face recognition system identified a photo of Serena Williams as male with 89% certainty. Again, the operation of these machine vision applications to view Black women as not being women further entrenches racist and sexist views. Finally, we have the ways in which we as humans in our society shape our technology in the litigation around the use of automated algorithms and artificial intelligence in criminal justice, employment, and housing. In the 2016 case of State v. Loomis, the Wisconsin State Supreme Court upheld the use of a computer algorithm to determine a prison sentence, even though the defendant was denied access to the algorithm itself. In 2009, in Ricky v. DeStefano, the US Supreme Court upheld a racially discriminatory process of promotion and prevented a community from throwing out the test results despite its disparate impact on Blacks and Hispanics. And in 2020, the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development changed its rules relating to the Fair Housing Act to allow landlords and real estate owners accused of racial discrimination in renting and selling homes to use software algorithms as a safe harbor to excuse racial and gender bias. Our legal system, thus, appears to be set up to approve the use of machine intelligence to maintain inequity, but then to deny or prevent the use of that same machine intelligence in order to remedy or at least mitigate this inequity. That concludes our remarks. I am grateful for having been invited, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on the panel.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for that clarion call for us to raise our collective awareness of and skepticism toward uncritical techno-utopianism, and also to recognize the real effects of technology systems on the ways that we believe, the ways that we interact with each other, and the ways that we treat each other. Our second panelist in the conversation today is Nicholas Carr, who will be challenging us to think deeply about the ethics of automation, with a particular focus on contemporary workplace de-skilling. Nicholas?
Great. Thanks very much, Gerald. And let me just also say what a pleasure it is to be able to contribute my own thoughts to this profoundly interesting course everybody's been going through. Which raises such important issues, as we've already seen, that cross many different areas. Artificial intelligence, I would argue, is fundamentally an automation technology. And by automation, I'll give you my definition of automation. To me, automation means the accomplishment of human ends by technological means. So AI automates human analysis, human judgment, human decision-making. And it's one of a whole large set of new kinds of automation derived from computer processing, from robots to digital sensors, to all sorts of other algorithms, all intended to, on the one hand, make our lives easier, make business more efficient, and again, coming back to the definition, accomplish things that we used to do ourselves through machines and other technologies. If you think about many of the areas that this course has focused on, all of them, I think, are being profoundly influenced by artificial intelligence and other technologies of automation. That's certainly true of manufacturing, education, healthcare. But beyond those areas, you can look at law, architecture. In fact, I would argue that pretty much every realm of human activity, both in terms of work, but also in terms of leisure activity, are being altered, changed in deep ways by technologies of automation. In other words, what we're going through as a society, and certainly as an economy today, is a new division of labor between human beings and various digital technologies. And I think this is happening, as has been true with lots of changes that come from computers. This has been happening very, very quickly. And as a result, we lag behind in trying to proactively address what kind of division of labor is in the best interest of human beings, and will lead to a society that is more just and has more qualities that we would associate with a good society. So what I'd like to do is look at some of the things, very important things that we've learned about computer automation and automation in general through studies by human factors researchers, human-computer interaction researchers over the several years, because I think to make the right choices here as we move forward, we really should look very, very closely at what we've already learned about automation and its human effects, which is extensive, and also look ahead to what we need to learn more about. So if you look through the literature, it's clear that automation in general leads to several problems, or several potential problems, or at least challenges that we need to be aware of. And I'll focus on two of what I think are the major ones. The first is a phenomenon known as automation complacency. And this simply means that as human beings, when a machine begins to do things for us, assuming it does a pretty good job, we very, very quickly put our trust in the machine. And what happens as we do that is we begin to tune out from whatever it is we're doing. And often today, that means monitoring the machine to make sure everything's going correctly, or monitoring the computer. We begin to get complacent. And we see this phenomenon of automation complacency all over the place. One of the most notorious places where this emerges is in the area of aviation. The general story of automation, of flight automation, is a very positive one. It began about 100 years ago. And throughout those 100 years, as flying has become more automated, it's generally become safer, more efficient. You need fewer people in the cockpit and so forth. So the general story of automation through the years in aviation is a very positive one. But recently we've seen a shift, in a very concerning shift. What happens more and more these days is that a pilot of a commercial airliner only flies the plane for about 3 minutes on average. Minute and a half during takeoff, about a minute and a half during landing. Otherwise, they switch on their automated systems, autopilot systems and related ones, and essentially become computer monitors, inputting information from time to time, watching the various screens that surround pilots these days. And what happens, and it's not surprising, is that they become complacent. They begin to lose situational awareness. And then in those rare times when an emergency breaks out, they need to take time to reorient themselves. They act flustered, frustrated, and in the worst cases, this leads to air crashes. And in fact, the Federal Aviation Administration now says that most of air crashes and near crashes these days are automation related. They emerge from this poor planning of how human beings, the pilots, and computers should interact in flying a plane. And the way we've gone, simply saying, switch over all responsibilities and roles and work to the computer, undermines what has become the most important role for the pilot, which is making sure that the automation is working correctly, and that if something goes wrong, they can be an adequate and successful backup to prevent disaster. So the second major problem that we see, recurring problem we see associated with automation, is known as automation bias. And if complacency comes out of our trust in the ability of computers to handle the work we've given them and to do it without any failure, the automation bias emerges from our trust in the accuracy of what computers tell us. And here too, there's all sorts of research that shows that when you get some kind of judgment or get data or analysis from a computer, people are extremely likely to take it as gospel, to not challenge it. And here too, this leads to all sorts of problems that have been documented in that as computers play an ever larger role in analysis and decision-making, tend to be proliferating even faster than ever before. So for instance, you can see it in the work of radiologists. More and almost all radiology today is automated to one extent or another. Images, X-rays and other images are taken in digital format, and very, very often they're run through computer analysis, an algorithm that does the first examination of the medical image, highlights areas of concern and so forth. And what we found through studies of what happens to the human being, the human expert, the radiologist, is that they tend to whatever the computer tells them, they tend to follow those kind of hints and those kind of lead. They let the computer lead their eyes in their analysis. So on the one hand, if you look at the outcomes of the digital analysis of medical images, on the one hand, lots more diseases seem to be spotted by the computers because computers are very good at doing that. And they lead the eyes of the doctor to those potential cancers or whatever. But almost offsetting that entirely is the fact that radiologists and other doctors who read the images now tend to overlook areas of concern more often than they used to, because they're focusing only on those areas highlighted by the computer analysis. In one way of thinking, they just look wherever the computer tells them to look. We also see bias in many other areas. We see it in driving, the incidence of professional drivers, truck drivers and so forth, running into low overpasses has gone up substantially since drivers have begun to rely on navigation systems, because instead of paying attention to the road, paying attention to signage, paying attention to what's coming up, they simply follow the directions of the mapping system they're using. And we see this with everyday drivers as well, and it will become more and more of a problem as cars continue to get more automated. And also, and I think maybe this is the most worrisome area, as machine learning algorithms, AI algorithms as we call them, become more commonplace and provide more and more judgments in all sorts of areas, automation bias will prevent us from thinking critically and challenging whatever recommendations or judgments come out of the computer, come out of the AI systems. So as Anthony pointed out, a lot of these systems are subject to data bias. If the data that goes into machine learning algorithm is biased in some way, as it often is because it draws on historical patterns, then what comes out is often biased as well. And if we simply take the word of the computer and give undue weight to it, we may overlook those biases and simply go with whatever the computer tells us. So, as I say, in all sorts of areas of automation, automation complacency and automation bias have been identified and have become problems, even as people get lots of benefits from automation. These things continue to haunt attempts to automate work, from manual work to professional white-collar judgment-making work. But I would argue that automation complacency and automation bias point to an even deeper problem as we move forward further and further into our automated age. I believe what happens is there are undermining people's own ability to develop expertise, particularly very rich, very deep expertise in talent. And why is that so? Well, think about how we come to gain expertise, particularly very complex talents in doing pretty much anything. It's through a process where you have a task to do, and you make an effort. You work hard at that task, whether it's an intellectual task or a manual task or whatever. And it's through that effort that you develop skill. You know, it's only through doing when it comes to work that you get knowing. So that effort, that hard effort, being challenged is essential to developing rich skills. And once we develop those rich skills, we have new talents, then we come to a next task, which is often a harder task because our skills have gone up, and we go through that process again. So this is kind of the virtual cycle of learning. You're challenged, you rise to the challenge through hard work, you get better skills, and then you can take on tougher problems. And again, you go through that and your expertise grows and grows and grows. Well, there's a fundamental conflict between that process, which is a process, I would argue, very much in our interest as human beings, and the interests of software programmers and systems engineers. Because when you think about what programmers and engineers, technologists are incented to do, it's to find, when they're working in automation, it's to find those areas of greatest human effort and automate them. That's where the big bang for the buck is. So what you see over and over again is that where those areas where people are struggling, where they're challenged, where they have to work hard, where they have to take time, those are precisely the areas that get automated fast. And as a result, what happens is we're not challenged. We don't have to go through that effort, and that breaks this virtuous cycle, and means we don't get the opportunities to develop these rich skills. And what happens, I think, is in place of the virtuous cycle, you get a destructive cycle, a vicious cycle. So instead of you face a task, instead of being challenged, you hand it over to the computer. And as a result, you're not engaged with it. You don't get practice. You don't develop skills. And if you had skills, they get rusty because you're not practicing them. And that leads you to ever greater dependency on the computer, on the automated system. Why does this matter? Well, what I would argue is that we have this idea of automation as being something that completely replaces human work and human effort. Oh, you know, the automated car will take over all driving. The machine learning algorithm will make all our choices for you. The recommendation engines on Amazon or Netflix will tell you what to watch next or buy next. I think that's a misreading of automation throughout history, now and in the future. I think what we know about automation is it rarely replaces the human being when it comes to difficult, hard, challenging work. What happens is the human being and the automation, the system, have to work together in one form or in one way or another. And the reason for that is that despite all the gains we've seen in artificial intelligence, human beings continue, thankfully, I think, to have enormous advantage in many areas. One thing, for instance, only human beings have real world experience and the kind of richness of insight that comes with that experience. Human beings have fluid intelligence, the ability to see something we've never seen before, come up to a challenge we've never seen before, and very quickly work it out, make sense of it, figure out a solution. We have common sense, we have conceptual thinking, ability to take in new information and put it into a very broad context that computers, no matter how sophisticated, lack. We have critical thinking, we have creative thinking. So human skill, human expertise remains as important as ever. And in fact, in many ways, I think it becomes even more important as we have to become critics of algorithms, critics of robots, critics of machines. It's very, very important that we maintain throughout all professions, all areas of work, very rich human expertise, human skills, human talents. And if we allow computers to make us complacent, to bias our readings of information, and to undermine our ability to develop these rich talents, then we're we're setting ourselves up for a world in which we don't get the benefits of human expertise, just at the moment that we need human expertise, I would argue, more than ever. So I think we need to start by challenging this dominant design philosophy that says, whenever you come up with a task, find where human beings are working hard, where they're challenged, and automate that. Relieve human beings of effort. And there's many ways you can do this, and I'll just point out two or three in the interest of time. You can automate after a human being masters a skill rather than before. We see this, for instance, in how schools use calculators. For many years, this has been a source of concern for parents and others. And what we found is if you first make sure a student has mastered a particular mathematical skill, and then allow them to use the calculator to automate that, that allows them to go on and build ever greater skills. But if you suggest that they use the calculator before they've built up their own expertise, that blocks them, prevents them from ever building into a higher level. So automate after mastery rather than before. Second thing you can do is constantly transfer control, responsibilities, and other things inherent in control between computers and computer operators. So for instance, one idea in avoiding automation-related accidents in air flight is, instead of allowing a pilot to simply switch on the automation system and then forget about it for the rest of the flight, every once in a while, you have the computer say, okay, pilot, I'm going to switch responsibility for flying the plane back to you for a certain amount of time. And what we know from human psychology is, if you realize there's the chance that you have to take control, that increases your awareness, situational awareness, increases your engagement with the task. A third design idea would be to allow professionals to assess a situation before providing algorithmic aid. This is, for instance, think about the radiologist. Instead of running a medical image through an algorithmic, a piece of software that assesses it, first let the expert, first let the doctor, first let the radiologist look at it clean. And then after he or she has made their judgment, then you run it through the algorithm, and the computer challenges the human judgment and adds another layer of judgment rather than replacing it. So there are very practical ways when we look at automation in any area that we can begin to address these issues, these problems, and make sure that we maintain our ability to develop our own expertise. And this matters, let me end by saying, I think this matters for reasons beyond our work skills, our productivity, our efficiency, our skill at production, and so forth. I think it comes down to use a phrase that Anthony used, human flourishing. One thing we know about us is that actually, even though we kind of think we want our lives to be full of leisure, and we don't want to be challenged, and we don't want to work hard. In fact, if you look at psychological studies, you see that often people feel they're most satisfied, they're most fulfilled when they actually have accomplished a hard task, when they've worked hard, they've succeeded in doing whatever they set out to do, and they feel that they have a new set of skills that they can apply in the future. So it's very, very important, I think, just for the level of human flourishing, to make sure as we get more and more automated, that we carve out a place for us, for human beings, where we can be challenged, where we can work hard, and where we can develop our own skills. And I fear that if we go down the path we've been going down, we'll end up creating a world that is very well suited to robots, but is not very well suited to human beings. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. I really appreciate the chance to consider the broader context of technology, especially from a psychological perspective in the ways that we deal with these automated technologies. All right, so rounding out the scope of the conversation today will be our third panelist, Ethan Zuckerman, who's going to introduce us to what might be a somewhat less familiar concept, digital public infrastructure, but one with fascinating historical parallels and significant implications. Ethan?
Sure. Well, everyone, it's wonderful to be with you. I'm sorry we can't do it in person, but obviously the spirit of the moment. It's also really a treat to be here with such great thinkers and to have a chance to get insight into how other people are looking at this particular moment in technology. Alexis offers this really sort of hopeful vision that we might be able to steer AI technologies in a way to help us sort of care for one another, even when we're distant from each other. Anthony has a viewpoint that I think is absolutely critical, which is that for the most part, we don't seem to be building technologies that way. We seem to be building them in ways that are surveillant and sensile and judgmental, and that in the long run seem to be baking our biases into algorithms and may have some scary implications for our freedom. Nick suggests that this very active automation is something that could have significant downsides and that could get in the way of developing our own expertise and our own opinions. And I think in general, what you're seeing is this sort of thoughtful critique of technology that we're really starting to experience as tech becomes a much greater part of our everyday life. We can look at these systems that seem to be transforming our world, but we can look at them through a critical lens and sort of ask the question, who are they benefiting? Who are they hurting? And what might we do to change the path? So the area of technology that I primarily work in is around this area of social media. I spend a lot of my time thinking about Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and some of the sites that you may not have heard as much about, like Gab and Reddit and 4chan, and thinking about what these platforms and the conversations they host, what effects these have on us as individuals and on us as a democracy. And 2020 has not been an easy year for all sorts of reasons. And I think a lot of people are looking at these platforms and sort of saying, well, guys, you're making it worse. These platforms seem like they're pushing people towards political extremes. They're spreading mis and disinformation. They're making it harder rather than easier for us to talk to one another. Maybe in general, these platforms are actually making us angrier, making us less able to connect. These are all really worthwhile questions. And I'll tell you, as a scholar in this space, not only are they worthwhile questions, they're difficult questions to answer. A lot of the very large scale studies that have been done around whether social media makes us happy, for instance, come out essentially saying, on the whole, social media might make us slightly less happy, but the correlations are tiny. There's a giant study that's recently been done about teenagers and the effects of social media on their happiness. And there's a very, very small negative effect, but it's basically the same size of an effect as eating a diet rich in potatoes, which is to say you are more likely to be unhappy as a young person if you are short or if you wear glasses than being a heavy social media user. It has an effect, but it's sort of a tiny effect. A lot of these stories that we hear are extreme stories. When we see someone like Kevin Roose talking about people falling down the YouTube rabbit hole, that may be true, but there's 999 people who didn't fall down the YouTube rabbit hole. So with that as a caveat, what I want to say is actually it's really worth asking this question of whether Facebook and YouTube and others could be bad for us. And the reason it's worth asking that is they have not been optimized for our benefit. These platforms, for the most part, are designed purely for commercial reasons. And the ways that they operate have certain assumptions behind them. The assumption is that these platforms are going to be free and they're going to be free forever, and therefore lots of people are going to use them. And because the only way to get lots of people to use it is to use advertising, and particularly surveillance advertising, that's going to be the model that they work on. And as Anthony suggested, as people use these platforms, they may amplify some of the angrier material and may actually sort of push us towards political extremes in one fashion or another. Here's my intervention within that. That's not the way these platforms necessarily have to work. And the analogy that I would offer is an analogy that comes out of US history. In 1961, Newt Minow becomes the incoming head of the Federal Communications Commission under President Kennedy. He's a Democratic activist. He's viewed as being quite far to the left. And frankly, the television executives are terrified of him. Television has just gone through some big scandals. There have been scandals around rigged quiz shows. There's a real rush towards commercialization of this relatively new medium. And Minow speaks to the first time to broadcasters about 4 months into his term. And he says, look, I ask you broadcasters to spend the day watching your own programming from the time the set goes on the air to the time that it goes off the air. Don't have a book in front of you to distract you. What you will see is a vast wasteland. And he says this not because he thinks television is inherently evil. He just feels like the medium is falling so far short of what it could be. He, in the same speech, says television at its best may be the most compelling medium we've ever seen, but it is so seldom at its best. So people freak out. They assume that what Newt Minow is going to do is demand government control of programming, take these things off the air. For those of us who remember the television show Gilligan's Island, you may remember the ship that gets wrecked on the shore is the SS Minnow. That's actually a Newt Minow reference. That's the programmers who are making these entertainment shows who Minow is criticizing are really worried. And so they're poking fun at him in the context of making one of these very silly shows. What Minow does instead, though, is start pushing for alternatives that could help close gaps in television in the United States. He starts pushing for access to satellites and access to networks that can deliver programming across the country. He starts putting in place some of the institutions that later become the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And by the early 1970s, we have National Public Radio, we have the public broadcasting system, we have innovative new programming coming up like Sesame Street that is explicitly going after areas that were not well served by commercial markets. Local programming, programming for youth, educational programming. I think we may be reaching a PBS type moment for social media. I think that the markets and venture capital so far have taken us quite far down the line of where we can go as far as how these platforms work. And I think it's worth looking at them now and saying, what happens if we operate along a very different sort of logic? The current logic is that we use big platforms like Facebook. We all use the same platform. All 3 billion users have the same tools. We've got no role in how that community is run or governed. We have very little visibility into what the rules for speech are on that platform and no control over it. While the network is free in it, that it's ad supported, we are then the product. We are under surveillance, and information about us, who we are and what we do is sold to advertisers. These systems want to be their own thing. They want to not play nicely with anyone else, and they want to make as much money as possible. And part of what I'm suggesting is, what if we could change that logic? What if, in addition to things like Facebook, we could start having publicly funded social media tools? These would work very differently. They would not be one big platform trying to serve billions of users. They would be thousands of platforms with different purposes behind them. You might join one platform and only log into it once a year, a platform that runs your town meeting. I live in Lanesboro, and we would benefit enormously from having a space where only Lanesboro residents could get together and discuss the town budget for about a week before town meeting and maybe a day or two afterwards. You might have other networks that have certain rules behind them. Maybe a code of civility in which we agree that we're going to interact with people who we might have political disputes with, but we're going to try very hard to keep things civil. Maybe other spaces in which we're just interacting with our closest friends where anything goes. But we could have different affordances, different norms for different uses. We can build networks that are interoperable with existing networks. I don't necessarily want anyone to have to quit Facebook. I'd really love to build a system where you can stay in touch with friends who are on these existing networks, but you're also free to join these new networks with different purposes associated with them. And most critically, I think it's really important that these new spaces are self-governing, that when we join them, we are committing to the project of trying to figure out what are the rules of the road, what goes on this particular community, and how can we as individuals be involved with that. And I think that's critically important, because I think that, as Bob Putnam has identified, we've lost some of the abilities to learn how to participate in small d democracy, as we've lost neighborhood organizations, as we've lost the Elks Club or the Rotary or so on and so forth. Many of us now have our social interactions online, but we have them in spaces that we have so little control over. So how do you do this? Actually, from the technical point of view, it's not that challenging. There's lots of people out there pioneering different forms of social networks, many of them which are not controlled by one large company. The biggest problem is actually usability, getting people to use them. And a lot of my research at MIT and now at UMass is around building tools that allow you to use existing networks like Facebook or Twitter, but also use some of these new networks at the same time, so that you don't have to leave those existing relationships. You can build new ones as well as the existing ones. And I think that's enormously important. There are some legal challenges around this. Facebook doesn't want to be compatible with new sorts of networks. They're going to fight attempts to do things like this. We're also going to need ways to figure out how to support this. The way that the existing net economy has been built has largely been from venture capital money. Many of these tools that I'm talking about are good for us as public goods, but they need to be supported more like we would support a library or a park, rather than something that's potentially going to make a ton of money. I find myself leaning on Paul Romer's work. He's a Nobel-winning economist who has suggested that we start taxing surveillance online advertising. And he wants to do this just because he thinks that form of advertising is actually really bad for us. I want to take him up on this and have those taxes come in place, but I want to use that money to subsidize something which is like a digital corporation for public broadcasting, an entity that uses thoughtful research to figure out how could we build new digital online spaces that might help us be better citizens and better neighbors. So that's the work that I'm taking on right now over at UMass. You'll see more of it. I'll be publishing and talking about it. But more broadly, what I wanted to talk about is, as we have conversations about this one, as we look at technologies that are coming down the pike, whether it's AI as a storyteller, whether it's facial recognition, whether it's these different forms of automation, it's critically important that we have these conversations about the positive and negative implications of all of these. But one of the things that I think is just so important is to remember that we are not helpless in these conversations. We can start by going through this work of critique, but the next step beyond that is to articulate, what do we want these tools to do, and how would we transform these tools so they do a better job for it? I want social media that helps me not only stay in touch with my friends and stay in touch with the news, but helps me be a good citizen and a good neighbor. And my work now is to try to figure out how to build that. I think the technology industry needs first that culture of critique, but then second, this ability to go a step further and say, let's actually think about those long-term goals, whether what we're building gets us there, And if it doesn't, can we take on different approaches to designing and building technology that ends up being more consistent with our values? So let me stop there because I know that we've got a lot of questions and I'm sure great conversation going on. Thanks for the chance to be with you.
Thank you, Ethan, so much, especially for reminding us of our agency in the futures of technology. And I know that everyone listening is joining Catherine and me and Ollie in thanking Alexis, Anthony, Nick, and Ethan, all of you for this marvelous conversation. With that, we do now have a little bit of time, first for our participants to possibly have a bit of conversation with each other. So our speakers, if you've heard something from one of your co-speakers that has some resonance with, or maybe presents an interesting complication for your own research or practice, this is a great opportunity to dig into some complex implications of these complicated issues. And while that's going on behind the scenes, Ollie is also working to curate a lot of the activity that's been happening over in the chat as well. So we're also going to bring that into the conversation to make sure that folks have an opportunity to bring their questions before the panel as well.
I have a question for Ethan, if I may. I love this idea of a digital corporation for public broadcasting or a digital public infrastructure. I've been working in government for over a decade, and I feel that I'm the first to admit that government has not done enough to make sure that social media platforms and networks are good for democracy and good for citizenship. So can you talk a little bit about what role government plays, do you think, in this model of yours?
Sure. Well, let me say, for starters, the way that I'm sort of trying to launch this work is leaning first on sort of universities and philanthropy, right? I think at first what we need are some examples that you can build social networks that help probably existing communities, probably existing groups of people who already have relationships with one another, interact, govern themselves, sort of move forward in all of this. And then the hope is to sort of learn from and kind of expand that work. Where I look at governments largely is on this question of citizen participation. So I gave the example of a town meeting. I think another way to think about this would be participatory budgeting. I think a lot of the tools that we have right now for this are pretty ill fit for purpose. We have tools that we use right now that we're pretty good at using for rallying a bunch of people. But these are not generally great tools for listening or for taking turns or for compromise. And so one of the things that I would love to do with these experiments is look for situations where governments are looking for more citizen input and try to figure out, are there ways that we can build tools that make that input useful, plausible, practical. In the book that I've got coming out in January, I look quite a bit at the government of Taiwan, which after sort of overthrowing the existing government in something called the Sunflower Revolution, brought in a government that had a lot of open source software geeks associated with it. And what's ended up happening is that every government department now has someone in charge of outreach via online communities. And so you've got very interesting tools that are now being built to try to figure out how to get comments from hundreds, and it's not tens of thousands, it's hundreds of individuals who want to participate in these processes. One of the huge disappointments has been that it's not thousands, it's not hundreds of thousands. It's not that everybody is going to take their time and sort of get involved with this, but even building systems where a few hundred people can get involved and can share that experience with their friends, with their families on existing social networks might really change our relationship with governments. So my hope on this is the first few years of this is almost surely to be funded by people who are trying to transform the digital space. But I think where it really gets traction is if it's helping create new digital civic spaces that relate to local, state, national political issues. And then over time, where I'm really hoping we'll go with this is creating some sort of a subsidy that works on creating these digital social infrastructures that will complement and over time become alternatives to a space like a Facebook or a Twitter.
How do you think about, one thing we know about Facebooks and Twitters and Googles is that they're very good at subsuming other people's ideas very, very quickly when they get even a little traction. They might not do it in a way that's quite as good as a more specialized service, but because people find it convenient to, sign in once and stay there.
Sure.
Have you thought about how can you protect these kind of incipient, fledgling public options from just being picked off by the
Nick, let me tell you a funny story about that. The first piece of software I've developed in working through this idea is called Gobo. There's an early version of it up at gobo.social. It's basically a tool that lets you combine different parts of your social media into one place. You can look at Twitter and Facebook, and you can have more control over how you see them. One thing I added to it that makes a lot of people happy and a lot of people angry is a gender slider. You can change how many men and how many women you're hearing from. It has a mute all men button. I didn't add a mute all women button. That was by choice. So one of the features that Gobo has is you can see why each post has ended up in your feed. You can click on it, it flips over and says, here's why this ended up in your feed. And we introduced this and we wrote an essay essentially saying, Facebook should do this, this should be mandatory on all social networks. And 2 months later, Facebook introduced the feature. And that's fine by me because I'm not a for-profit startup. I'm an academic and I'm an activist. And frankly, if I can get that change into Facebook by pointing them in the right direction and having them subsume the idea, that's actually a very real way to make change in the world. Beyond that, I'm trying to architect this in such a way that it is single sign-on, right? But it's single sign-on that you have control over. You've set a username and password. As people spin up a new network that you might participate in, you have the option to log in with those credentials. My hope is that these networks are actually too small to be worth picking off. I think one of the key problems with something like Facebook is that it's got 3 billion users in the community. There is no community that has 3 billion users. Arguably Pittsfield is a community. It's 40,000 people. We might all know each other. We might all know each other, through 1 or 2 levels of connection. 3 billion people, it's not. I'm interested in building social networks that link 20 to maybe 20,000 people. I think that's actually where they have the ability to be deeply transformative and where we can learn lessons about how we might treat each other better and where we might really go directly after some of these biases that Anthony talks about and very consciously sort of try to connect them. So my hope is never to reach the level of success where Facebook wants to buy me, but I'm hoping they ruthlessly copy what we do if we can demonstrate that it works.
I'm just going to hop in here and note that this is, we could go for 3 hours, of course, in this conversation. I just want to check in and make sure, see where we're at in terms of queuing up any audience questions. Catherine, where are we at with that?
We do have a few audience questions. So I'd like to give Anthony a chance to ask a question if he would like to before we queue up the audience. And I know we're almost out of time, but I'd like to give him a chance to.
Thank you, Catherine. I have more of a comment than a question. This is part of the conversation we're having about alternatives to social media platforms like Facebook. And so it's more of a comment. But my thought is that the space in which innovation can occur. And so if you believe in free market driven innovation, this is important to you, occurs when you don't have monopolies. And so we have on the books antitrust laws that we haven't really been very aggressive in enforcing. And so in some sense, the current form of Google was able to be created because of antitrust legislation against Microsoft, right? So that's kind of the space for it. And so maybe what we need to have is more types of whatever Google search for search engines, more types of social networking in the case of like a Facebook competitor that are going to be able to have a robust presence in the world, and to get there may require some antitrust action. So it's more of a comment than a question, but I throw out there that it's important that we have kind of the nonprofit or not-for-profit initiatives, but then also we need to have a space for those entrepreneurs who are looking for the profit but are getting crushed by the big tech Goliaths.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Anthony. And I guess part of what I would say is I worry that specifically in the field that I work in with social media, that we're actually having a little bit of a failure of imagination. That we so assume that the path towards success is the one that Nick talked about, which is building something that Facebook wants to buy, that we have a lot of innovation along the lines of TikTok. You know, wouldn't it be fun if I could do a silly dance and then you could do a parody of my silly dance? Not that TikTok can't be used for good purposes, but I don't see a ton of people out there essentially saying, how can I build a social network that gets Republicans and Democrats to list their viewpoints about contentious issues and sharpen their best arguments. But the way, there is one out there, it's called gel.com, G-E-L-L. It is not rolling in the dough right now, and Facebook's not gonna go and pick it up anytime soon. I think we may need alternative ways of supporting experiments like that, and I'm hopeful that we'll see ways to make that happen.
Okay, thank you. And that's actually a good segue to questions about regulation and the state of the regulatory environment around social media, around AI programs that are being used. And so a question for all of the panelists is, what's your evaluation of where the regulatory environment currently stands? And Alexis, I'd like to start this one with you, since you work in a governmental entity, and I hope you're thinking about this, and I know from your book that you're thinking about this a lot.
I am. Thanks for calling on me. Although I was going to defer to the lawyer in the group, but I'm on the spot, and I'll try not to get myself in trouble here either. I mean, I think where the regulatory activity needs to happen is at the federal level, and I don't just say that because I'm working at a city level, but that's really where there's going to be some action that will be meaningful. But I think that there's a lot of challenges to that, not just political challenges, but one of the issues that we see with a lot of the big tech companies is that they're so diversified into so many new areas beyond their primary services that even if you went after one of their services or products, it doesn't mean that they would just cease to exist or go away, or that they wouldn't sort of pop up into some other entity. I think that the time for meaningful regulation was probably about a decade ago. And I'm leery of I am an optimist by nature, but I do have my doubts about how effective antitrust regulation would be at this stage in the game. But I'd be curious to hear what Anthony has to say about that, who knows much more about regulatory law than I do.
Okay, Anthony, pass
Sure.
this to you.
So we could have a whole class on this. This is a really fascinating topic. So I'm going to skip a lot of
you back.
I'm going to skip a lot of content here. I'm going to get to Alexis's comment in a moment. I'm going to take a little detour here, and this is my thought. A century ago, in the early 1900s, we had problems with our food preparation and our drug products, right? And so there were exposés published by the Muckrakers, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, about problems in the meat packing industry, for example. And that led in 1906 to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which at that time was the most invasive and extensive regulation in U.S. history. It put thousands, if not tens of thousands of companies out of business who could not comply with the regulation, but we needed it to have safe food and safe drugs, right? we've had that same pattern throughout history with respect to environmental regulation with the EPA, car safety with seatbelts, and so on. We're there now with software, software in general and machine learning in particular. And so we're just maybe missing our muckrakers or missing our Upton Sinclair's the jungle. And so what it really means is this, is that perhaps what we need to move toward is a software construction standard that says that we consider safety and fairness, right? And so when I think of that construction standard, I include cybersecurity and data privacy, and also some of the qualities of machine learning fairness, transparency, and accountability. So all this is in a system of making it a safe standard. And the analogy is simple. When you build a house or build a bridge, at least in the United States, we have a construction code. We don't just like throw any random materials to the bridge and have it collapse or to have the house collapse. And so there's no construction code for software and for machine learning algorithms. So that's my first suggestion. But on the antitrust comment, I put it out there because I think that there is some value in it. But as Alexis points out, maybe the better time was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So that ship may potentially have passed. And so that's why the bigger picture is one of a structure that's going to allow for the ability of citizens in our society to influence how these software systems and these machine learning tools are being used and operated. And a way to get there is through antitrust enforcement. Another way to get there is through having the Federal Trade Commission, for example, look at algorithmic accountability and thinking about software systems. That could be a second avenue, so agencies. And of course, the third avenue, of course, would be having a legislation out there at that level. So maybe we need to have a new agency, the Agency of Software Safety. I don't know, but that's going to be my very, very short answer before we get into too many legal jargon and technical issues.
Okay, I'd like to ask a follow-up question because of a word that has been used in today's presentation. It was also in the discussion for the last 2 weeks, and that's interoperability. So last week in our discussion of healthcare, it was pointed out that our 3 primary healthcare systems that serve the Berkshires, BHS, CHP, and Bay State Medical Center, all have 3 kinds of electronic health records, none of which are interoperable. And so rather than helping us control our own healthcare, we are in a situation where it's impossible for the healthcare systems, and for many people, they move among and between these systems to use those systems to share information to improve their healthcare. So as we think about ways in which the government or regular humans could address these issues, what kind of tools could we use to create greater interoperability? And Ethan, you touched on this, and I think Anthony, you've touched on this. So I'm going to kick it to the 2 of you first. And I will note that we're already 2 minutes over, so I think this will have to be our last question.
There's always a tension between interoperability, which makes systems more useful, more compatible, and privacy. This has a huge amount to do with what's going on with the health records situation. When HIPAA came on board, we declared certain technologies privacy preserving. We declared others that are not. This is one of the reasons why every medical office still has a fax machine. It's one of the things that HIPAA considers to be private. When we're looking at information that's maybe a little less sensitive than medical information, there is the possibility that you could mandate certain types of interoperability. And this is certainly something you could do in social media. You could say that once you're at 100 million users, you need to have the capability that someone can interoperate with those users. But exactly the same question is going to happen. How do you prevent them from being spammed by an advertiser or being targeted by something like Cambridge Analytica? A lot of these systems require this really thoughtful perspective where you look at who the adversaries might be, how people might make the worst of the situation, as well as how we make the best of it. And they're really hard dynamics, doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Okay,
Yes, that's very important. A case study of a way of putting government services online in a secure fashion is Estonia. And so the country of Estonia spent about a decade on this effort to create e-Estonia, or the e-government. And they use a combination of technologies, including a version of blockchain, for example, along with encryption. And so they've guaranteed interoperability for their records and a way of preserving privacy at the same time. So under the system, if a government official accesses your record, that's recorded, and you're able to know that. So it is possible. It just requires a great deal of regulatory action and effort by, in this case, the government entities in question.
Okay, thank you. And that brings us back to one of our earlier sessions where a guest from Sweden, from the Swedish embassy, pointed out that in Sweden, there's an app for paying your taxes online. So it seems like there are some other countries, Estonia and Sweden, that have addressed some of these privacy and security questions in a different way than we have today. So we are out of time. I'd like to thank Gerald as our moderator for today, and I'd like to thank all of our presenters. There's just been such an incredible wealth of knowledge shared, so many difficult questions that we need to contemplate. And well, I hope we can invite all of you back.
Absolutely.
For future sessions. So thank you so much. And for the OLLI class members, our final class is next week. And James and Deborah Fallows will be our guests. James Fallows is one of the senior editors and writers at The Atlantic, and has done they've done extensive work looking at how rural towns and small towns and communities have reinvented themselves using tech as a key economic driver and organizer. So if you want to learn about that and how we might think about that in relation to the Berkshires, please join us next Thursday for the final class in this series. And again, thank you so much to all of our panelists.
Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.